So our next speaker is Dr. Sarah Marusek, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in religion studies at the University of Johannesburg. Her doctoral research at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University focused on Shia Islamic activism in Lebanon. A manuscript of this research entitled Faith and Resistance, The Politics of Love and War in Lebanon will be published by Pluto Press in 2017. Her current work looks at decolonial frameworks, resistant rationalities, and comparing Muslim, Christian, and other theologies of liberation. So please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really honored to be here. And the organization of this conference has truly been fantastic. I want to repeat. I'm going to take a slight diversion away from my usual research and what we've been talking about here to talk about the future as imagined artistically, and it's a bit dark, so prepare yourself. Many dreamers in MENA are turning away from realism and the nightmares of the present towards the futuristic lands of science fiction and fantasy, imaginary places where they have the freedom to openly reflect on their social predicament and sharply criticize those in power. Indeed, it is reported that dystopian literature and Arabic fiction has proliferated in recent years. The same trend can also be seen in the arts. A summer 2016 exhibition in London billed itself as a dazzling journey into the future of Palestine through both utopian and dystopian visions of what lies ahead. This event took place against the backdrop of a particularly bizarre spectacle: the official Palestinian museum launching in Beirut without any exhibitions or artwork, perhaps a reflection of the absurdity of the contemporary movement. In this paper, I briefly discuss the rising oppression in Egypt and Palestine, what I call the dystopian present. I then consider Western representations in the Middle East before exploring how the Arab imagination is conceiving the next generation's demands for social justice through art and literature. I focus in particular on two novels by Egyptian writers, Basma Abdelaziz and Mohammed Rabi, and Chapter 31, an odd piece of research on the many virtues of the Oriental imagination, a new exhibition of mostly Palestinian artists inspired by the 1974 science fiction novel, The Secret Life of Said, the Post-Optimist by Emil Habibi. Drawing on interviews with the writers of both novels and the curators of Chapter 31, perhaps reflecting my ethnographic social scientific background, I conclude by considering what the turn to dystopic artistic spaces might mean for the shape and potential of future social mobilizations across MENA. So I'm not going to go into this in as much detail as in the paper, but I just want to highlight some of the characteristics of what I call the dystopian present in Egypt. In a very highly publicized case, a three-year-old boy was sentenced to life in prison. In a less publicized case, a 15-year-old schoolboy was arrested for having a Rabbah ruler and notebook, and as we know, this was the massacre in August 2013. 529 people in total were sentenced to death for the alleged killing of a single police officer. And then in the artistic side, Alfan Midan, Art is a Square, was actually shut down because the authorities thought the word Midan aroused suspicions. A writer has been sentenced to 3 years in prison for criticizing an Islamic ritual on Facebook. And then, as we know, 10% turnout for the initial parliamentary vote in 2015. So onto the dystopian present in Palestine. This first one's really quite creepy. There is actually a company out there called Faceception that says it can identify a terrorist with up to 80% accuracy simply by analyzing a person's face. So I definitely recommend you all put on lipstick on the way home. The scariest part is that they actually have a contract with the undisclosed Homeland Security Agency already, so they're working for some government out there. Israelis have arrested a Palestinian poet for a Facebook post and a YouTube video of her poem. She's still actually under house arrest. The trial continues. Meanwhile, in a more publicized case, Saudi Arabian court delivered a death sentence to another Palestinian poet. Of course, this was later retracted. And meanwhile, a 23-year-old Palestinian clown has been indefinitely held by Israel under administrative detention, and he's supposedly been arrested for his support for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And of course, we know that there have been no elections for the Palestinians since 2006. So these extraordinary human circumstances, a dystopian present that is a history without ends, not the end of history, shape not only the writers and artists in MENA, but also their work, providing another archaeological layer to help us to decode their predicament. As Jayusi points out, what one is dealing with in literature is not necessarily the recounting of events in their normal sequence, but the description of their effect on the characters of a fictional mode. In the case of Habibi's novel, a mechanized force is seen at work, blindly executing a policy of mass evictions, mass arrests, usurpation of property, and physical torture. The overwhelming repetition of Palestinians recounting from where they were exiled, the occupation forces seen to be monitoring even what you whisper in your dreams, and humans being considered state property, all illustrate the spiritual effects of war, exile, and occupation on the Palestinians of that time. In this way, literature can become a social critique, or, in the least, a way to inspire people to seriously question how we have arrived at any political moment. This can be an incredibly powerful tool in post-colonial contexts where the colonized have long been ascribed a narrative, as is the case in MENA. Even the imposition of naming the uprisings, the Arab Spring, is one example. Said famously described this Western objectification as Orientalism, where the colonized must struggle to even narrate their own histories. As Syed also explains, people become without history not because they lack a past, but because, paradoxically, they cannot narrate themselves into the future. People without a history are either nameless and thus not really a people, or they are named by others. So naming oneself begins with the narrative, and whether this narrative is visual or written does not really matter. It just matters that it's one's own. Dystopian literary critic Mark Hillegas has remarked that the modern turn to literary visions of the future as nightmare is one of the most revealing indexes to the anxieties of our age. Indeed, the rapid emergence of post-apocalyptic art in the face of global warming is telling. Those of you who are familiar with the British artist Banksy, think Dismaland, which was a big hit 2 years ago now, I believe. After people power in Egypt consecutively delivered rupture and continuity, both through popular street protests, it should not be surprising that Egyptians could be particularly anxious. A mock Facebook page called Mass Suicide in a Week, inviting people to kill themselves from the 11th of November 2016, the declared day of the Revolution of the Poor, attracted tens of thousands of followers. For the Palestinians, a nation without borders is already a living nightmare. The rise of dystopian configurations of the future is likely a response to this dystopian present. A number of Arabic dystopian works of art have been published since 2011. Here I focus on 2 Egyptian novels that have recently been translated into English. The first is The Queue by Basma Abdelaziz, an Egyptian writer and psychiatrist who counsels torture victims. Her inspiration for the novel, her first, occurred in late 2012, while she was, quote, walking in downtown Cairo one morning when she saw a long line of people standing in front of a closed government building. Returning hours later, she passed the same people standing listlessly, a young woman and an elderly man, a mother holding her baby. The building remained closed. Aziz explained to me that she was compelled to write a satirical work of fiction, not because I was trying to escape from the authorities' punishment, but because it was an artistic choice. She further added that by the end of 2012, I felt that the reality was becoming a kind of absurdity and that the documentation of the actual events was neither available nor even fruitful or satisfying to me. In Aziz's word, The Queue satirically imagines how humans would build in our imagination an exaggerated conception regarding the smartness, the strength, and the cleverness of a totalitarian authority. How we would use this conception to resolve our internal conflicts, saying, oh, it is that strong, so we can't face it. Oh, it is that smart and clever, so we can't defeat it. The sum of this is, let's surrender and give up. No need to resist, we will keep waiting. The novel, set in the distant future, begins with a short summary of the political turmoil in an undisclosed Arab country that resembles recent developments in Egypt. The disturbance is centered around protests quashed by security forces against a shadowy entity known as the Gate, which had come into power after an earlier uprising that successfully challenged the security forces but then fractured before overthrowing the regime. The latter appears to represent Mubarak's fall, but the former almost predicted what was to come. Aziz wrote the novel before the 2013 military coup. The second novel is Otored by Egyptian writer Mohammed Rabi. Its superfluous violence is anything but satire. However, much like Aziz, Rabi barely disguises his critical engagement with the Egyptian experience, even referencing the crushing of pro-Morsi protesters in Rabaa Square in August 2013. Of course, there are also additional acts of fictional brutality committed by Egyptian security forces to have happened in the future. Overall, killing is the predominant theme of Otored, and when I asked Rabi if there was any hope in his novel, he simply replied, La, no. The novel takes place in Cairo, mostly in 2025, centering around the character of Ahmed Otored, a former Interior Ministry officer who is a member of the resistance against mysterious forces occupying Egypt. Rabi details in an excruciating manner mass killings. The literality of hell is repeated over and over again, not to mention its centrality to the plot. Egyptians are actually living in hell. The key characters are almost exclusively male, the ultimate death sentence for humans. The only exceptions are the abused prostitute Farida and the faceless Zahra, perhaps a metaphor for the ambivalence of the Egyptian people today. Many of the Egyptians we encounter in Cairo's apocalyptic future are zombie-like, wearing masks and either craving death or mindlessly inflicting it upon others. A drug known as carbon is what allows people to function in everyday life. During the high, one enters a mental darkness on the inside, but is pleasant and functional on the outside, capable of doing daily work. So this is the perfect drug for a neoliberal, postmodern future, where human worth is not determined by political, religious, or ethical values, but by efficiency and usefulness at work alone, what Lyotard once called performivity. Here, the Egyptian society in 2025 is so powerless, hopeless, and tired that it can only function machine-like by using carbon. Thus, while the effects of carbon are dissimilar to those of Soma and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, both drugs play the same role in society, preserving the status quo. On the other hand, the characters in the queue are still not only waiting, but also trying to engage with the powerful, even if they are not very successful. Unlike Rabi's zombies, Aziz's characters are alive and over the top, quite similar to those in the theater of the absurd. Her dystopian story revolves around Yahya, who is shot in the stomach while peripherally observing the quash protests. He is carried to a clinic and Tariq, the attending surgeon, examines him before notifying him of his injury and the need to operate. However, Yahya is instead sent to the official Zephyr hospital and released without them removing the bullet from his intestine. Meanwhile, his X-ray is seized by an authority, and the gate makes a series of public announcements to cover up its brutality. At first, it prohibits surgical operations to remove bullets. Then it requires official permission for X-rays before attempting to completely rewrite the protests as an international movie set where fake bullets and actors were involved. Yahya and his friend Nagi are forced to wait in a queue to the gate in order to request his X-ray and seek permission to remove the bullet. Indeed, everybody in the queue, which never moves, seeks an official declaration to make sense of the suffering in their lives. Another central character in the queue is Amani, Yahya's girlfriend. She attempts to retrieve his X-ray from Zephyr Hospital, but is caught. In a chilling scene, she finds herself naked and possibly raped. Unlike the grotesque detail that Rabi forces upon the reader, Aziz never actually indicates for sure whether these fears have been realized or not. However, we do know that Amani's life unravels from there. She loses her job, becomes distanced from her friends, and even starts to believe the gate's propaganda that Yahya is not actually dying from a bullet wound. Meanwhile, Tariq's life is also disintegrating from his inaction and dependence on drugs. However, he does eventually decide to operate on Yahya without a permit. After revealing that the authorities have been tracking Tariq's every move and recording it in Yahya's file, but do not include his secret plan to remove the bullet, Aziz leaves the ending open. Does a sympathetic intelligence agent create an opening for Tariq to conduct the illicit surgery? Or is this a trap for Tariq, which means that Yahya will succumb to his wounds? In the end, we do not know for sure. While senseless violence is a recurrent theme in Otored, pain is ever present in the queue. Both leave disturbing effects on the reader. Do we fight a repressive, illogical system in pain, or do we deliver ourselves from this hell through mass killings? Aziz points out that normally, those who are waging resistance against tyranny believe in certain doctrines or have specific beliefs to defend, and so can withstand the pain. However, in the dystopian present, any coherent ideology is a luxury. On the mass suicide Facebook page, Egyptian followers shared posts describing, quote, how death does not seem so bad for those who are living in Egypt, since they consider themselves in hell already. While all users expressed their depression in what seems to be funny posts, most of them agreed that they actually have, joking aside, considered committing suicide several times. God says, if I kill myself, I will go to hell. It doesn't seem fair to live in Egypt in this life and go to hell after that, one user said. Of course, literature is not the only medium to communicate dystopia. In summer 2016, P21 Gallery in London held an exhibition on the future of Palestine curated by the Sarha Collective, created by Nadia Jaglom, a visual anthropologist, and Mai Kanane, who has a background in philosophy. The exhibition features 15 artists, mostly Palestinian, and takes its name, Chapter 31, from the same chapter in Habibi's satirical novel, in which Said the Post-Optimist explains how resilience, even simply telling stories, is a form of resistance under occupation. As the curators remarked, the title satirizes the Orientalist gaze with which so many Palestinian artists have been scrutinized. They said that the inspiration for creating the exhibition was the time they spent in Palestine. We were both struck by the contrast between the fatalism with which people in Europe spoke about the future of Palestine and the energy and determination with which Palestinians themselves would debate and discuss the future. Everyone we spoke to had a unique take on what that future held. The artists in the exhibition tackle themes of resistance, oppression, confinement, and violence, illustrating how occupation is internalizing to become a suffocating despair or even boredom, showing another layer of dispossession through the corrosive effects of neoliberal capitalism. The Palestinian experience of simultaneously always being on your way somewhere and always being trapped is reflected in the artist's work. Thus, the curators divided the exhibition into general themes of utopian and dystopian. The former featured on the ground floor of the gallery, which is here, and the latter in the basement, signifying a journey between two alternate realities. Nevertheless, any distinction between utopia and dystopia ultimately breaks down under the weight of occupation, exile, and the commodification of space, with one artist featured on both floors and others in between. Furthermore, the utopian works are often more to do with reclaiming Palestine. For example, Sameh Hijawi's Paradise series includes 4 collages, each compiled from personal photographs, images, and classical Palestinian paintings, and magazine cutouts of exotic landscapes. This is not the retelling of an idyllic past, but the painful intersection of memory and loss as the foundations for an unstable future. Much like Aziz and Rabi, the future that the artists in Chapter 31 imagine is critically engaged with the present. For example, a particularly bleak feeling of entrapment is explored in Rafa Assad's painting of an enormous black billboard blocking the view to a beautiful spring landscape, a horizon no longer visible beyond an advertisement that has no aspirational lifestyle to sell. A powerful statement on the bleak Palestinian future, it is also an honest representation of neoliberal capitalism. Ala Abu Assad's contribution includes a series of 8 photographs that capture the contradictions of human sexuality and life under occupation. As the curators note, the scene could just as easily be of torture as of post-coital lethargy. Assad turns a common stereotype of male virility on its head through images of barren lands. A macabre, almost post-apocalyptic atmosphere is felt through images of various unpeopled sites in Palestine, which make reference not only to ethnically cleansed villages, but also to a newly neoliberal Ramallah, in which so many buildings are, in fact, empty. One is reminded of the Zionist propaganda that calls Palestine a land without a people. By reinventing this myth as a critique of neoliberalism, Assad is engaging in a powerful act of narration. The writers and artists featured in this paper help to illustrate that, in hindsight, many of the Arab uprisings were more like spectacles than revolutions. While mass public protests defied all odds, giving Arabs a sense of freedom and euphoria, the totalitarian infrastructure in the region remained largely intact, if not strengthened. The board argued that our modern neoliberal life is nothing but a collection of spectacles, where everything that was directly lived has receded into representation. In this way, mass street mobilizations are commodified into representing democracy, but without delivering equality. Just like consumption cannot alter the social relations of capitalism, protests alone cannot change a totalitarian infrastructure, even if these revolutionary movements were in fact able to transform the Arab psyche in profound ways. The problem with euphoria is what comes next when things do not work out as planned. Feelings of alienation and helplessness, as apparent in the proposed Egyptian mass suicide suicide event on Facebook. What is so striking about the novels selected is that future choices seem to be so limited. For those unwilling to resist, it is either death or waiting for the impossible. Of course, in Habibi's case, outer space is a possibility. Ironically, because of their long history of loss and dispossession, the Palestinian artists in Chapter 31 are slightly better positioned to creatively imagine a future by accepting their loss. Nevertheless, when all of these future dystopias are full of violence, loss, and oppression, the purpose of humanity does look bleak. One is reminded of the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow soliloquy in Macbeth, in which the eponymous character indicates his indifference to everything. Of course, Macbeth is guilty of murder and tyranny, and the Egyptian and Palestinian people are not. Still, the internalization of the Egyptian uprising's failure and the Palestinians' inability to secure liberation is clear in these artistic works. There appears to be a collective responsibility that emerges. Although extremely painful, it also illustrates the promise of love, the possibility of a better future that can be co-constructed collectively. Since the arts allows for spaces to be created for both political engagement and reflection, it is imperative to harness them as meaningful, constructive spaces. And I want to add a point that the writers and artists did sort of resist against the over-politicization of their work, yet at the same time mentioned that they were engaging in a political critique. But it's just really important to not over-politicize their work. I just wanted to end with one picture that relates to Habibi. It's not a part of Chapter 31, but I think it really captures the possibilities through art of imagining a better future.
Thank you very much. So our third speaker is Dr. Nermeen Allam. She's a social science and humanities research council postdoctoral fellow and visiting scholar at Princeton University. She holds a PhD in international relations and comparative politics from the University of Alberta. Her research interests include social movements, gender politics, democratic transition, Middle Eastern and North African studies, and political Islam. Her current book, Women and the Egyptian Revolution, Engagement and Activism During the 2011 Arab Uprisings, is under contract with Cambridge University Press. So please join me in welcoming her. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. My study very much speaks to many of the themes that my colleagues Sarah and Habiba raised in their presentation, and expands a bit further on some of the themes that they raised in the presentation. Let the buyer be aware note. This is a qualitative study. There isn't fancy tables, there isn't fancy regressions, so hopefully they're not going to get very nauseous from it. So the study, today I'll be presenting on the politics of hope and disappointment in Egypt, post the 2011 uprising, the January 25th uprising that has led to the ousting of former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. The study is part of a larger project on the politics of hope and disappointment in the MENA region. The study came out of my field research in Egypt and in Tunis. So allow me to tell you a little bit about the field study, the field research, and specifically how it ignited my study. So in 2012, I went on my first round of field work in Egypt. I was examining the experience of women in the uprising at that time. The aura that surrounded the interviews during 2012 was one that was marked with hope, was marked with optimism and a belief in a better future and a belief in the possibility of change. Fast forward 2 years later, in 2014, I went on my last round of field work in Egypt. And the aura that surrounded the interviews at that time was one that was marked with despair, disappointment, and even perhaps a sense of futility. And the aura was so vivid that I started asking my participants whether if that was it, if that was the end of reform and change. However, they were quick to deny it and to quote, to stress that things cannot go back to the old times, end of quote. A lot has happened in the 2 years, now 3 years following my field work. However, as I continue to follow their activism on the ground, I am assured that that's not it yet, or that's not it, but at least not yet. The experience of field work and the complicated feelings of hope and disappointment, the complicated feelings of participants as they experience this hope and disappointment, left me asking questions about the nature of regime change and democratic transition. And in today's presentation, I'll try to answer some of these questions within the context of Egypt, and more specifically while focusing on women's experience post the uprising in Egypt. And specifically, I ask, how did the politics of disappointment unfolded in Egypt? And how activists continue to maintain hope and to sustain their activism, notwithstanding A, their disappointment in the political process, and B, the closing of the political space in Egypt. And this question is an important question to ask and a significant one to answer for a number of reasons. Disappointment in the political process is becoming the new norm, and this is not only in Middle Eastern societies, this is not only in new democracies or newly aspiring democracies, but this is in all democracies as well. Consider the recent US elections, consider the normalization of misogynist discourses in politics, fractures in the international liberal system, and the rise of the far right in the West. Second, and more specifically within the crux of my research, women are largely the first and foremost group to experience disappointment following regime change and democratic transitions. Thus, surveying the ways in which women maintain hope and sustain their activism is important to locate their agency rather than their plight, to locate spaces for mobilizations, and to avoid stereotyping women as passive and to avoid stereotyping the whole region as stagnant. The methodology in carrying out this research, the data was gathered from 53 semi-structured interviews with 5 sets of actors. The 5 sets of actors are female protesters who participated in the uprising, female activists, NGO leaders, and state officials who are active in the agenda of women's rights in Egypt, and public figures such as Tawakkul Karman, the Nobel laureate, and the Yemeni activist. The data was analyzed within the prism of critical discourse analysis. This entailed a close and a multi-layered reading of the particular words of participants, with a view to not only what is included in the discussion, but what is excluded from the conversation as well. The research is situated within the politics within the literature on contentious politics and political process model. So I conceptualized the uprising as an episode of contention. So while revolutions can either fail or win, episodes of contentions are characterized by their cumulative effect, regardless of the cycle's immediate outcome. And this approach is significant for my research because utilizing it, I can offer, and I'm able to offer a dynamic explanation of the challenges that emerged during the transitional period and how activists were able to navigate and were able to negotiate this difficult socio-political landscape. So my analysis suggests that, yes, disappointment does mark politics in Egypt. However, it does not mark the end of politics and activism. It rather gave rise to the politics of pragmatic hope. And I'll speak later about what do I mean by this. But first, I survey the politics of disappointment and what are some of the reasons and the factors that marked the experience of activists with disappointment. So the experience of activists was marked with disappointment because female activists, because of the persisting and because of state feminism and its influence on women's rights movement in Egypt. So several participants, they described how their loyalty following the uprising was questioned and how they were mockingly accused of sitting on the former regime lap, and how they were labeled as Bitoa Suzanne, which means in English that you are Suzanne's group or Suzanne's clique. And that was in reference to the close association between women's rights organizations in Egypt and the former corrupted regime of Mubarak. And this association, some of my participants argue, distanced the discourse of women's rights from its grassroots basis. And in a sense, it stained the legacy and the legitimacy of the movement. The experience of activists was also marked with disappointment because of the persisting power of the deep state in Egypt. So several participants expressed their discontent and their frustration over the persisting power of the deep state in Egypt. And the object of their frustration was the army and its control over politics in Egypt. So the army action, many believed, was driven by its fear over losing control of power and over losing control of wealth. And this power, many even argued, was always functioning in the background. So one activist described how we should rather look at Mubarak's resignation speech as a delegation speech. So Mubarak, she explained, gave himself the right to, and I've included the part of the speech. I've included part of the speech, the translation of part of the speech for your convenience. So Mubarak gave himself the right to delegate state authority to the army rather than leaving it to the constitutional mandate or leaving it to the parliament. And definitely the speech does not capture all the factors at play. However, it is a symbolic reflection of the power of the deep state and the kind of hurdles and the kind of challenges that activists had to hurdle with, even as they celebrated an ostensible victory over the regime and an ostensible concession over the regime. Oh, I feel like a celebrity with all those flashes. The experience of activists was also marked with disappointment because of the rise of authoritarian confidence. So the rise of authoritarian confidence can be ascertained in the widespread criminalization of dissent and the widespread silencing of opposition. And these attitudes are not only perpetuated by the regime, but these attitudes are also shared by large segments of the population in Egypt. And this support creates what I call a form of authoritarian confidence. Under authoritarian confidence, the regime's violent repression and violent oppression of dissent and of opposition goes largely unchecked and is mostly justified. And this support, this buy-in from the society, the regime secured this support and this buy-in from the society by using the human rights versus the security discourse, by capitalizing on the revolutionary exhaustion, as many segments of the population grew tired of the economic and the political burden of contention. The regime also secured this buy-in and this support by framing the regional and framing the international unrests as part of a conspiracy to bring down Egypt and to bring down its army, and using the case of Libya and Yemen and Syria to bring the point home. Finally, the experience of activists was, I jumped one slide. Finally, the experience of activists was marked with disappointment because of the prevalence of democratic deficiency in civil society. And this was one of the hardest thing to speak to with activists. And it took a great deal of self-reflection and self-reflexivity to admit. So several activists explained how they described the lust for power. They described the inability to move constant vilification of the others within the civil society organizations in Egypt, and this aura drove many of the activists away from the civil society organizations and even stripped many of these organizations and their leadership from their initial credibility and from their initial popularity among the larger segments of the population in Egypt. Egypt, however, is not an exception in this regard. So Robert Michel's iron law of oligarchy, he famously stated, who says political organization says oligarchy. He observed how oligarchy was a defining characteristics of the newly emerged political organizations. Recently in Egypt, there was a wide controversy over the wiretaped phone calls belonging to El-Baradei. And for all intent and purposes, there was a wide controversy over them. However, at the heart of these conversations, at least I think, there is a sharp yet an astute critique of the shortcomings of the civil society in Egypt. Notwithstanding disappointment, however, this activists continue and maintain their hope and the memory of social resistance through participation in artistic and social initiatives. So, for example, while women's rights organizations continue to fight for legal representations and they continue to fight for formal representations and legal rights, however, they're also increasingly working on spreading the gender equality and gender awareness through the social and through the artistic initiatives. So consider, for instance, the Oral History Project carried out by Markaz al-Zakira wal-Mara in Egypt, the Women and Memory Forum in Egypt. Consider the feminist satirical magazine, El-Shakmagiyya, the Keepsake, published by Nazra for Feminist Study, Project Harass Map, and also the growing trend of participatory theater and participatory plays in Egypt. And I think I have a few minutes in my allotted time, enough to show you part of one of this participatory theatrical play. The theatrical play, I attended this play while conducting my fieldwork in 2014, and the play was carried out in El Kitkat neighborhood. It was carried out at the Swiss Club in El Kitkat neighborhood in Cairo, Egypt. And the play narrated the daily lives and the struggles of Hania as she faced a young Egyptian girl, as she faced the daily struggles and gender discrimination at home and in the broader society. And the play closed with Hania's emotional cry as she is pushed to the ground by her mom and is approached by the midwife with a knife to circumscribe her. And the short clip that I will be showing you shows the vocal reaction of the female audience who were attending the play. It shows their vocal reaction to one of the speaker's statement. The speaker was a sheikh, an Islamic clergy, and he stated that the practice of FGM was rooted in Islamic traditions and teachings, and that it was important to safeguard women against adultery. So let's watch together women's reaction to the sheikh statement. Oh. I wonder why it's not working.
Do we have anyone for technical assistance? No?
No.
Try to minimize it.
It has to be downloaded.
Well, it's recorded, so it's not an online. So. No.
The presentation.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, so bad. I'm not going to waste. Where? Which video tools? The other corner. Oh, okay, smart. Thank you. No. Okay, you know what? That's fine. If you really, really want to watch it, email me, and I'll send you the. The original. I don't have the original file on. Yeah, I don't have it. Yeah, so. Apologies. Okay, now I'm showing my incompetence as you are giving me alternatives, and I'm saying that no can do, no can do. So anyway, the reaction was very vocal. It was almost as if it was a fight with the sheikh. And again, for those of you who knows Egypt, that was in El Kitkat neighborhood, which is one of the poorest areas in Egypt. And following women's reaction to the sheikh, I left with a sense that hope and reform might be possible, and that it might take place when and where you least expect. And the experience, apologies, activists also maintain their hope and the memory of social resistance through their engagement in critical debates over long-standing controversies, in long-standing what we call in Egypt taboos, in a sense. Oh, I've been warned. Okay. So a counterculture of diversity, and a counterculture of non-conformity can be unmistakably noted in Egypt. And this culture, this counterculture, is particularly among the younger generation in Egypt. And this counterculture can be ascertained in the many publications that are coming out and that are revisiting and that are refuting classical religious texts, others demystifying the aura surrounding key national events and key leaders and key nationalist figures in Egypt. Several participants also argue that this aura, this counterculture, can also be ascertained in the increasing number of atheist and self-identified sexual minorities in Egypt. And whether the number of atheists and self-identified sexual minorities have increased, or whether they are becoming more visible and they are becoming more vocal, I argue that the uprising created an opening in our public debate. And it is this opening, rather than the idea of atheism, that I am interested in. And these openings are important for the democratic transition because they promise to encourage freedom of speech, and because also they encourage to produce critical polity that is able to dissect, that is able to critique and engage with different and with competing ideas. As one of my participants eloquently described, a tiny splash of color in a largely plain toile. It doesn't mean that diversity have been achieved in Egypt, but that the society is nudged to contemplate with its foundations. So in conclusion, disappointment does mark politics in Egypt. However, it does not mark the end of politics and activism. And my survey of the politics of disappointment in Egypt is not an invitation to write the uprising obituary. It is rather an invitation to appreciate the small and the simple forms of activism that managed to emerge and that managed to develop notwithstanding all the odds. My survey of the politics of hope is an invitation to locate nods of hope. These nods of hope might become part of the effective repertoire of activism in the next cycle of contention. As social movement theorists attest, fear can be overcome and hope can be manufactured through these small yet tangible victories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. Okay, we need the microphone there.
I'm going to ask several questions, and
if you can please introduce yourself.
Oh, hi. My name is Joelle. I work at the Arab Council for the Social Sciences. My questions will probably relate to one presentation more than the other, but I would love to hear everybody's feedback if they feel that they can pitch in given the research that they've done. To start off, Habiba, if you can talk a bit about counter narratives that may be taking place as a way of sort of challenging the hegemonic discourses so far in terms of who gets to decide what violence is, all of those definitions that are currently running around in Egypt, and who gets to use them. And if there are if we are relating the believability or the legitimacy of the discourse that is coming, how does that maybe play into the whole factor? So if we see the SCAF with an authority and a kind of legitimacy, how does legitimacy of counter-narratives play into that if we need this legitimacy sort of to have this powerful counter-discourse taking place? And also for Nermeen, super interesting work, very interested in how your approach of hope and disappointment. I'm wondering if there's a kind of analogy or any kind of sort of thinking about it in terms of approaching any kind of action that may take place, sort of relating it to the cost and benefit analysis. So the hope, there may be hope to do something, and then the benefit, you know, I might be disappointed or not. And also, if you can talk a bit about, so the current clampdown and ongoing clampdown on NGOs in Egypt, which is sort of limiting the work of maybe more formal groups, and how maybe informal or other kind of participatory collectives or any kind of participatory work that is taking place that is also sort of creating this force of resistance. And also, like in the talk that you made, it seems that there's sort of this individual, like what the agency that happens on a personal level, as opposed to this, not necessarily as opposed, but there's this and there's that, and they're both connected, and you have to see how they can both connect. So there is this work on this individual level, like the agency of the person in the circumstances that they find and any kind of resistance that they may have, and how, like, for example, this woman who sort of, you know, responded to that sheikh.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, in terms of a collective or collective action, so that to destabilize the power dynamics, how can we get from here to there? Or it's not an either or, but more about talking about the possibilities that exist in that respect. And one last thing about social justice. It seems that everybody's doing all this work in pursuit of this social justice, and yet there's no social justice. I mean, with the work of Sarah, all these dystopian futures, you know, horrible results. Where's the justice in that? So it's not exactly a question, more of a comment. But I understand, like, the hope, and there is hope, basically. So that's, thanks.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? We need the microphone on this row. Oh, the two rows. Okay, maybe there it's closer, and then it's closer to here.
Yeah, my question is for Sarah. I really enjoyed your talk about dystopia and dystopian art and literature, and I was curious what, if any, kind of role social media or the internet has played in your research, because I think that you know, maybe 5 years ago, like the Arab Spring, even, there was so much optimism about human connection and you know, how this will help everyone, how this will democratize society, and it seems like people are becoming much more skeptical about what how the digital age is affecting our daily lives, from privacy to crackdowns to so many other things. So well, you've noticed in all of this.
Okay, and another question on this row, please. On your left, there, right behind you. Yes.
Thank you. I was not only impressed by the three presentations, but I was moved by the power and the emotion behind these three presentations. I don't have questions, but I have just you know, few comments. For Sarah, I think it is very useful to include cartoons on Egyptian daily newspapers, particularly on Al-Masri Al-Yawm, and I think until yesterday, you know, you should examine cartoons by Amr Slim. Fantastic and very critical. So I think this would be also another way through which artists express their critique of the regime. And for Nermina, there are still signs of hope. Of course, the framework is an authoritarian regime, but there are some initiatives, like the establishment of an institution called the Egyptian Association for Safeguarding the Constitution, and it monitors violations of the Constitution and publishes statements in newspapers, and it is headed by Amr Musa. There are also several initiatives among young people who try to think what would be the future. And so I think also, I think you can read editorials, columns in two Egyptian newspapers, Al-Masri Al-Yawm and Al-Shuruq, and they are very critical of the regime. So I think you see signs of resistance even under these highly repressive authoritarian conditions.
Thank you. I guess we don't have any more time for questions, so we'll just have you answer the questions for the next few minutes. Maybe we'll start.
Okay. For the counter-narrative question, I think there are various ways to do this, and it's already happening. It's very slow, but it's happening, and it's there. One of those ways is the formal institute role in this, and how that actually there is a lot of work in forcing those institutes to recognize what happened and do some commemoration. Like, for instance, when Maspero happened, Pope Shenouda was on the national TV, and he said, "Dol mish abna el-Kinisa, those are not the church children." And it was like the green light for the army to do what they did. But actually now there are many sub-churches that in their way to recognize what happened, and they are really keen about this counter-narrative. Another way is the informal way, which is the virtual realm, in a sense, using social media and blogging and creating this virtual hub. And virtual hubs really are very hard to contain and very hard to limit, not only for the Egyptian regime, for many other regimes. Yeah. The final thing, in Egypt we have 53 prisons versus 27 universities. So working on those kind of numbers would help a lot. Yeah. This is what I...
Okay, so I'm cognizant of the time limitation, so I'll be very quick. On the cost-benefit comment, yes, absolutely. There is cost, there is growing insecurities, there is a lot of intimidation in the political landscape. However, while we tend to focus on how immune is the structure and how intimidating the structure is, we overlook the fact that people's life is at stake. As one of my participants put it, we cannot afford to despair. So it's not only about how immune the structure is, but it is how this threats and how this challenges on the ground are too much to bear. So we cannot afford to despair, and that we have to act against it. On the significance of the social and artistic initiatives, definitely I agree. And exactly as you mentioned, one of the significance of these initiatives is that they are often, but not always, tolerated by the regime. And also they are viewed by the wider population as above the messy foray of politics and ideology, and thus they are better apt to represent the interests and better apt to introduce subtle social changes. And I'll conclude by this on, okay, we've been through all these uprisings, but where is the hope, and why we cannot see, real change? So Zollberg, social scientist, mentioned that the miracle in social movements and the miracle of episodes of contention is that they shorten the distance between the future and between the present. They don't jump. They only shorten the distance between the present and the future, which hopefully will hold a change. So Professor, on the emotions, I completely agree, and I think one of the things that political science and the literature on social movement is better at it is that they do acknowledge the power of emotions. And when we say emotions, emotions are not only emotions of enthusiasm and, and hope that leads to action, but even emotions such as disappointment and despair do lead to action, as they potentially can lead to action. And yeah, so thank you.
Sorry, I'll add very quickly, if I can. Firstly, I just want to thank the organizers for doing such a fantastic job of complementary papers for this panel. It really worked. And secondly, that it's an all-female panel, because this is a first for me. So just way to go. Regarding social justice, I think it's not something that you can sort of buy or sell or even ever realize. But I do think having spaces for being able to express oneself and in very creative and political and deeply critical ways, I think that's really important. I left a lot out in the presentation. I didn't get all Gramsci on you, but I think that these layers of civil society are really important to consider. And because religious institutions, particularly the official ones and Islamist parties, especially in Egypt and to a degree in Palestine, have become so alienating for a lot of youth, I think that other spaces are needed for them to express themselves. And I think that this, when I look at the artwork that's coming out of Gaza, for example, I'm just completely and the things they're doing with found objects, in their everyday lives, it's just really phenomenal. I mean, it's not going to deliver democracy, but I think it's another layer that they can work through to figure out what exactly that democracy will look like, or if they don't want democracy, some sort of social project that allows them to have more equality and social justice. And so I think, these spaces are important. And regarding social media, yes, it is a sort of catch-22 these days. I used it to get in touch with some of the authors, and it worked, which was really cool. But I think that I think it's really dangerous to use social media for many artists in particular, because they put themselves out there. A lot of the oppression that's happening across occupied Palestine and in Egypt today in particular are as a result of social media posts. But then you have that mass suicide Facebook event page, and it sounds crazy, but that must have been very therapeutic for people to realize that there are this many of us going through this, and they were using humor to get through it. And there is a sort of sense of solidarity there. You can look at it both ways, but I think that cautiously, social media is just yet another tool that we could use or we could ignore in our struggle.
So thank you very much. Sorry for the delay. We started a little bit late with the session due to technological problems. So we'll thank the panelists once again. Thank you, and we will leave the floor for the keynote talk.